Good evening to our audience here in Sydney and Guten Morgen nach Berlin. Welcome to this special Lowy Institute digital event with Germany's Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs, Annalena Baerbock. I'm Michael Fullilove, the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which the Institute stands, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. As you know, the Minister was due to appear at the Institute in person last week, but mechanical difficulties with her plane got in the way and she had to cancel her visit. But she was determined to press ahead with her appearance, and I'm grateful to her for speaking to us today from Berlin. So thank you to the Minister for keeping her rendezvous with the Lowy Institute. Let me tell you how today's event will work. I'll give a few remarks at the beginning, and then I'll invite the Minister to give a speech. Afterwards, I'll put some questions to the Minister, including questions from the audience. Frau Baerbock, you are the first German Foreign Minister to address the Institute, but as you may know, my chairman, Sir Frank Lowy, and I were honoured to host Chancellor Angela Merkel in 2014 when she gave the Lowy Lecture. As the Chancellor noted then, the relationship between Germany and Australia goes back a long time, and it's worth a great deal in terms of trade and investment. But the past 18 months have shown that apart from history and economics, our ties are also maintained by our common worldview, one in which the rule of law is respected and every nation has the right to find its own way in the world. In February last year, that vision was sullied when Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine. At that moment, the scales fell from our eyes. We understood, as the Minister wrote last month in The Guardian, that security is not a given. Since then, there's been a quickening of connections between like-minded countries like Australia and Germany that support the rules-based order. Of course, Russia's brutal, unprovoked assault on Ukraine is not the only challenge we face. In our region, the People's Republic of China is undertaking the largest peacetime military buildup in history, and its relationship with the United States is fraught. And as we watch heat waves and wildfires across Europe and North America, we also understand that climate change presents a formidable threat. The common thread between all these challenges is that they can't be addressed by any one country alone. They require cooperation and solidarity from all of us. In that spirit, it's a privilege to host the Foreign Minister today. Ladies and gentlemen, Annalena Baerbock came to politics at a young age, attending peace protests with her parents as a teenager. She studied political science and public law at the University of Hamburg and earned a master's degree in international law from the LSE. I also understand she was an elite trampoline gymnast in her youth, which equipped her well, I'm sure, for the ups and downs of public life. Frau Baerbock joined Alliance 90, the Greens, in 2005. From 2009 to 2013, she was the party leader in Brandenburg. She entered the Bundestag in 2013, and from 2018 to 2022, she served as co-chair of her party. She was the Greens' candidate for Chancellor in the 2021 federal election, and after that election, she was named Foreign Minister by Chancellor Olaf Scholz, becoming the first woman to hold that office. It is my pleasure now to invite the Foreign Minister to deliver her remarks.
Thank you very much, dear Michael Fullilove. Thank you for this very warm welcome. And I would like to join Michael in acknowledging all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander traditional custodians of country and recognize their continuing connection to land, sea, culture, and community. I pay my respect to elders past and present. I'm honored to speak today at the Lowy Institute. But of course, as you have said, I would have much preferred to do so in person. As you might know, I was forced to cancel my trip to the Indo-Pacific region at a very short notice last week due to problems with our plane. Thank you, Michael, for your kindness and especially flexibility in making this virtual exchange possible now. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, friends. 78 years ago, an Australian delegation traveled to San Francisco. Its purpose was nothing less than historic: to help draft the Charter of the United Nations, the rules that guide our international community to this day. What was special about the Australian delegation was not only that it included a woman, Jessie Street, something that was still rare at that time. What was also remarkable was that this delegation would be instrumental in shaping the United Nations as we know it today. Australia's Foreign Minister, Herbert "Doc" Abbott, who headed the delegation, had a clear vision. He believed that the maintenance of world peace should not rest in the hands of the great powers alone. He wanted middle powers and smaller nations to have a seat at the table as well. Abbott didn't succeed in his aim to restrict the veto powers of the permanent members of the Security Council. But he successfully advocated, also on behalf of many smaller powers, for giving the General Assembly a stronger advisory role than the great powers had originally planned. Back in Australia, Abbott told Parliament, "The United Nations," I quote, "is the best presently available instrument, both for avoiding the supreme and ultimate catastrophe of a third world war, waged with all-destroying weapons, and also for re-establishing an international order which can and should assure to mankind security against poverty, unemployment, ignorance, famine, and disease." Unquote. I'm recounting this episode because it is unwavering belief in international and multilateralism, in cooperation and dialogue, that also unites our two nations today. Because unlike other countries in the world, we don't hold veto power in the UN Security Council. Neither are we greatest military powers. We believe that it is the UN Charter, our international order built upon common rules, that is protecting all states, no matter how big or small they are, no matter where they are located. That is why we will not turn a blind eye when these rules are broken. Because if we fail to do so, I believe no one, anywhere, would be able to sleep peacefully, because we would all have to fear the attack of a bigger neighbor. That's why in Australia, although your country is some 15,000 kilometers away from Ukraine, you stood up firmly against Russia's war of aggression, as did many other medium and smaller powers across the world. At a time when the UN Security Council was blocked due to Russia's veto power, it was indeed the General Assembly that spoke out firmly, condemning Russia's war with an overwhelming majority of more than 140 states across the world, condemning Russia's war of aggression, condemning the fundamental breach of our UN Charter. We showed that the General Assembly is our joint voice, our voice for peace, our voice for our global rules, our voice for our common security. Australia's support for Ukraine has been unwavering. Through its political engagement, its military assistance, its strong support for sanctions, as well as its generous humanitarian measures. What we have seen is an outstanding effort also by New Zealand and other regional partners. We applaud this support, and we won't forget it. I think this shows that although oceans might separate us, Germany and Australia, we do have a common understanding for the enormous challenges we face. what we see is the emergence of a world of increasing systemic rivalry, in which some autocratic regimes seek to bend the international order to increase their spheres of influence, using not only military might, but also economic clout. This is especially true for the Indo-Pacific, a region which not only matters to your security, but also to ours in Germany and Europe. Because we share an interest in an Indo-Pacific that is peaceful, a region where common rules are respected, where every state is free to determine its future by making independent political and economic choices. A region that is neither unipolar nor bipolar. A region where shipping routes are open, where free and fair trade preserves the economic dynamics that have brought prosperity to hundreds of millions in the region. A region where all states join hands to address the climate crisis. A region where men and women and children see their rights respected. And I truly believe that middle powers like Australia, like Germany, New Zealand, and so many others are not condemned to be bystanders when it comes to shaping such an Indo-Pacific. We have agency to build a better future, even when faced with enormous challenges. Herbert Everett already knew 80 years ago that we can make a difference if we work together, if we build coalitions. Cooperation amplifies our voice, unity multiplies our power. And when I look at our partners here in this vast and so beautiful region, I'm confident that we will get ahead on this, because our trust and cooperation is already solid in so many areas. It's clear that the Indo-Pacific will play a decisive role in the 21st century. 1/3 of global GDP is generated here. Today, around 1/5 of Germany's global trade is with the Indo-Pacific region as a whole. Countless jobs in cities like Hamburg, Frankfurt, or Leipzig depend on these trade relations. And I don't only mean China by this. Yes, China accounts for a large share of our economic relations with the Indo-Pacific, but all the other Indo-Pacific countries together actually form the bigger share. As a matter of fact, ASEAN is now our third largest trading partner outside of Europe and after China and the US. Our technological and scientific progress also depends on the brilliant ideas of men and women in both our regions. Malaysia, for example, is the second biggest country of origin of the microchips imported to Germany. Or did you know that an Australian-German company based in Marburg is one of the leaders in research on how to treat hemophilia? To me, these examples are examples of solid bonds. It's our joint values and interests that make me confident we can meet the main 3 security challenges we both face. Strengthening the global rules that we all rely on, bolstering our economic security, and accelerating our joint battle against our biggest global security threat, the climate crisis. Firstly, that means firmly and jointly standing up for these rules that men and women like Jesse Street and Herbert Evan laid out some 80 years ago. Because these rules ensure our common peace and prosperity. And this is not an abstract statement. When we see that half of all container ships in the world today pass through the Taiwan Strait, container ships which transport goods like medicines, machine parts, or food. As Germans and Europeans, just the same as you're here in Australia, New Zealand, or the Pacific Island states, we have a crucial interest in de-escalating and dialogue to avoid conflict. We don't accept when others bend our common rules. Any unilateral change in the status quo across the Taiwan Strait would be unacceptable, even more so if this were to include coercive or military means. The United Nations, with its rules and institutions, were built to prevent exactly this. That is why we stand up for these rules, for the respect for the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, as well as the arbitration ruling on the South China Sea. And we know we have to fill these rules with life. That's why we cooperate with Australia, Japan, Korea, and New Zealand in the East China Sea to observe compliance with the UN Security Council resolutions on North Korea. For this purpose, Germany dispatched a frigate in late 2021. Germany has also become a regular participant in the most important joint military exercise organized in Australia. Last year, Germany sent an Air Force contingent to participate in Kakadu and Pitch Black. Just a few weeks ago, the German Army and Navy participated in the biggest military exercise in Australia, Talisman Cyber. And we will certainly come back for the next rounds of Pitch Black and Talisman Cyber. Because if international law is broken in your region, it can be broken anywhere. Your security matters to our security. And let's talk straight. The Australian government has endorsed the findings of the Defence Strategic Review 2023 quite comprehensively. The review describes the deterioration of the security environment in the Indo-Pacific and the unprecedented strategic challenges, including the potential for major military conflict. And it leaves little doubt who is responsible for these worrying developments. It is China's military buildup, and I'm quoting the review here, that is now the largest and most ambitious of any country since the end of the Second World War. This buildup is occurring without transparency or reassurance to the Indo-Pacific region of China's strategic intent. Unquote. The fact that China has been so central to Australian debates on foreign and security policy has had broader consequences. According to a survey by your institute, Michael, the Lowy Institute, in 2018, only 12% of Australians perceived China as more of a military threat than an economic partner. Today, the comparable figures stand at 52%. I don't think this development in perception has come out of the blue. You, as a closer neighbor, have realized earlier than us what we have now also laid out in our government's China strategy. China has changed, and that's why our policy towards China also needs to change. To us, China is not only a partner, but also more and more competitor and a systemic rival. A partner on global issues like fighting the effects of the climate crisis, a trading and investment partner, but also a competitor, as it is to Australia and many other countries in the region. And increasingly, China is a rival when it comes to the very fundamentals of how we live together in this world, the principles of our international order and respect for human rights. The China strategy that my government adopted a few weeks ago looks at this new China and how we need to respond to it. And I want to state it very clearly. This strategy does not mean that we have become obsessed with China, that our sole interest is now geared towards our relations with that one country. Yes, one part of our strategy is about our bilateral relations, obviously, but the much bigger part is about how we should deal with the challenges posed by China across the world. And that concerns all of us. In Europe, in Africa, in Latin America, and particularly here in the Indo-Pacific. We see how numerous countries are pivoting more towards China. And we have to be honest about this. Often, this is due to a lack of alternatives. We would like to change this. And what's clear is that our office will not promote a new confrontation between blocs. We want to gain partners who choose to work with us more closely because both of us will gain from it. And that brings me to my second point, economic security. As Everett already said more than 80 years ago, we know that security is more than protection from military conflict and violence. Security also means being able to live a life free, not being subject to coercion or blackmail. And that means strengthening our joint resilience. Because the economy is geopolitical. Such a realization does not lead us towards decoupling. What we seek to do is to de-risk our economic relations. And crucially, that means diversifying, broadening partnerships that not only create economic value for both sides, but also help all involved to reduce risks. In Germany, in my country, we have learned, I must say, painfully, how vulnerable our one-sided dependencies on Russia's energy imports made us. And we don't want to repeat that mistake again. For many countries in the world, and particularly here in this region, China is by far their biggest trading partner. But China is not always as predictable, transparent, and reliable as is needed to allow a stable economic relationship. Australia knows what that means. That's why the European Union's trade policy seeks to help not only us Europeans to diversify trade, but also our partners, because it makes us all stronger. It's good news that the EU and New Zealand signed a free trade agreement last month, which could increase trade between both sides by up to 30% within the next decade. I had hoped we would also conclude the negotiations for the EU-Australian trade deal in July. We should now strive to really finalize it. The same goes for the free trade agreements with India and the ASEAN member states. We also want to strengthen our partnerships on natural resources that are key to the green energy transition. Australia has a leading position in this, producing half of the world's lithium and large share of cobalt, as well as raw earth. One challenge in establishing direct supply chains with Germany, however, is that there is little on-site processing. One example, more than 90% of the lithium mined in Australia is exported without further processing to China, while the EU imports more than 90% of its processed lithium needs from China. So the key question is, how can we diminish this risky detour? How can we politically support business in tapping into this I would say, potential. Australia is already planning new mines and processing facilities. And the good news, in April, Siemens, Andritz, and Plinke signed an agreement to provide key technologies for the Townsville Energy Chemicals Hub, which includes a refinery for battery materials. I believe we need more of such partnerships, because in a globalized world, also mining and processing is geopolitical. That's why de-risking means becoming better at seeing all economic interactions through a geopolitical lens. Here, with you in Australia, you experience painfully how China is willing to use economic coercion when it imposed restrictions on key exports like wine, meat, and coal to exert political pressure. You've actually been a role model in not bowing to that pressure. I want to express my great respect for the courage and the resilience, as well as the sense of proportion that you demonstrated. In the EU, Lithuania has also experienced such coercion from China. To be able to react to this kind of pressure, European unity was key, because China tried to divide European countries on exactly that point. So we as Europeans developed now the anti-coercion instrument, with which we can protect European countries against attempts at blackmail by third countries, with measures ranging from dialogue to tariffs or trade restrictions if required. We are also looking more closely at the actors that are investing in our critical infrastructure, in our ports, roads, or telecommunication networks. That's why we will strengthen foreign and security policy criteria in the investment screening process. And yes, we have learned from you. We have learned from Australia a lot in this, because we closely followed your debate on leasing a strategic port to a company from China. We followed your debate already a couple of years ago on 5G, on cybersecurity. This has clearly shaped our policy responses. To conclude, I want to address our third security challenge, the biggest of our time, the climate crisis. A crisis that is causing destruction worldwide. Australia has seen devastating bushfires. Half of Asia is suffering from recurring storms, heat waves, and rising sea levels. And again, I want to state that very clearly. It is up to us to form coalitions to bring about change. That is exactly why, together with Australia, we support the Pacific Island states in making their voice heard. On Saturday, we opened a new German embassy in Suva, Fiji. Unfortunately, as I said, our plane problems meant that I wasn't able to be at the opening myself, which I deeply regret. The key focus of our teams there will be to help battle the effects of the climate crisis in the region, and to help the most vulnerable states with climate impacts that can no longer be reversed. And for that, major emitting countries like mine carry particular responsibility. At the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, we agreed to set up new financing mechanisms for loss and damage. We are now working hard to use existing mechanisms better to set up new structures. And we want to see substantial decisions made on this at COP28 in Dubai, I hope together. Australia's bid for COP31, together with the Pacific Island states, is the key opportunity to show how strong Australia's commitment is to lead this battle together with those countries that are most affected. I'm glad that we are in this marathon effort together as well. 78 years ago, in San Francisco, Jesse Street, Herbert Everett, and their colleagues knew what we know now. We will only be able to shape our future together as partners who can rely on each other, who will stand up for each other, no matter how big or small we are, because our security depends on it. Thank you very much.
Minister, thank you very much for those important remarks, which will be read closely in capitals across Europe and Asia. Thank you for mentioning Doc Everett, one of Australia's great foreign ministers, as well as Jessie Street, one of Australia's great feminists. And thank you also for agreeing to take our questions. We've got about 25 minutes or half an hour to put questions to you. I'm going to kick off. I want to focus on the Indo-Pacific and climate, but I want to start with Europe, if I may. Let me ask this. You've been an activist in pushing Germany towards a values-based foreign policy and also in standing up to Mr. Putin. Do you think that previous German governments deserve criticism for their softly approach to Russia and China?
Well, obviously, we have changed course, which we highly needed, and some neighboring countries have told us already a couple of years ago. It was not only debates you were having in Australia with regard to your dependency, but we had this big debate. You might have heard about it also in Australia about Nord Stream 2, our gas pipeline, and we had already Nord Stream 1, another gas pipeline, whether this is a purely economic pipeline, as governments before in Germany labeled it, or whether, and this was a call, especially from our neighboring countries, the Baltic states, Poland, but also Ukraine, that this has also a geopolitical, a security dimension, especially for Ukraine. And unfortunately, Germany in the past didn't listen closely enough to that. But this is spilled milk. So the important thing in politics, well, as it is in life, is always to learn from your mistakes, that you do not repeat a mistake twice. And this is why we have changed course. This is why the Chancellor gave his famous, I would say, speech about the Zeitenwende. And we have established in our national security strategy and also in our China strategy these learnings that we cannot have, again, dependencies which are capable of blackmailing us and also by that could threaten our own security.
All right, let me ask you about Russia. Last week, I interviewed Kaja Kallas for my podcast, and the Estonian Prime Minister described Russia as the world's last colonial power. Do you agree with that assessment of Russia? And what would Russia have to do in order to rejoin the international community?
Well, I might think about that a bit deeper if it's the last one, because obviously we see also other players in the world who mention their empires. But what we obviously see is that Russia has this whole strategy based on a narrative and a believing from the last century. They want to rebuild an empire which is not compatible with our current world order, because we have agreed that sovereign states are sovereign states and that every state has the right to their own security and territorial independence. And therefore, and this is again the learning from the past, and presidents like from the Baltic states have told us that because they suffered under the Soviet empire also in the past, that we should listen closely to speeches as well. Putin has said in the last years already that Ukraine actually belongs to Russia. He said that they have to bring it back to Russia. And when I was in Russia myself, just before the outbreak of the war, a couple of days before, I was asking the foreign minister Lavrov directly, so why are you saying you do not plan any invasion? So what are the 100,000 soldiers doing directly at the border? But this was the last alarming bell. We have seen and heard, especially the alarming bells before, and we have to take this very seriously. And your second part of the question about Putin coming back, I mean, the International Criminal Court had its arrest warrant because of war crimes. And I think this is so important in this debate, even though I like to talk about international law and you like to do it, but to bring it down what happens every day. So we are not getting used to just speaking theoretically about war. What he has been doing, I think this was important from the arrest warrant from the ICC because of the deportation of children. Also, these kind of methods, you can see the style also back in time. It was also back in time when the Soviet regime transported children from their parents to somewhere else. So it has a method. And bringing this to justice as a first part of matter, I think is so important because it has also shown other countries in the world, many African countries who said in the beginning, which frankly speaking, I can understand because they are thousands of kilometers away. Well, this is a war in Europe. We don't really know what happened. So what happened also in the past? What was before with NATO? All these debate. But when they heard and also saw, because they visited also Ukraine, what was going on with the normal people, with daily lives, with attacks on infrastructure, at electricity grids, that children were deported. I think this is so important in politics and international law that we don't forget that we speak about people and their suffering. And this is why, answering your question, if we see the arrest warrant from the ICC being charged with war crimes, crimes against humanity, obviously, there have to be consequences which follow this, because otherwise we give a message to everybody else, dictators in the world. Well, at some point we forget about your guilt, but this is not international justice. This is not what your foreign minister Avid planned for the General Assembly. This Russia today, this is also what we as the European Union formulated in our strategy. This Russia today cannot be a partner. But obviously, Russia is a neighbor of us Europeans. So this is why we are not only talking about the war in Ukraine, we are also talking about all the arrests in Russia. We are talking about the end of democracy in Russia, which has happened over years, because we want at some point to live together peacefully again in Europe with our Russian neighbor, but obviously with the Russian neighbor which is not attacking other neighbors in Europe.
All right, thank you. Let me ask you about the links between what's happening in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, which is the subject of your address today. When you were in China, you were quite frank in criticizing China for not condemning Russia's aggression against Ukraine. That has always struck me as odd because on China's behalf, because for decades, as you know, China has put respect for state sovereignty and territorial integrity at the heart of their foreign policy. And I've had Chinese interlocutors lecturing me on those subjects many times over the years. Do you think it damages China's reputation that it is failing to stand up for its own values and condemning Russia's aggression against a sovereign state?
Well, also there at the press conference, I was actually asking a question. So asking the question towards the Chinese foreign minister, why they are not speaking about the aggressor, because I think it's not up to me to lecture others what to do. But I believe that it's a fair question to say, so when we are talking about this war of aggression, which it is, why the word war is not being used, but crisis, or why there was and is the call from China to both sides as if this was a football game, and you say both sides, so keep up your good spirit and try to do the best. But obviously one country invaded another country and it was a fundamental breach. And if we were in sports or somewhere else where you rely on rules, you couldn't play anymore. And this is why I asked the question of saying, so why do you not name the perpetrator, the aggressor? Because, and this is also my explanation everywhere in the world, and I wanted to try to deliver this also with my speech. it is obviously a blueprint for others. If other countries see that at some point, also the international community just gets tired of saying stop the war, it might be an invitation for others. And I think this is also what China has realized over the last 1.5 years, that yes, as you have said, they are, like Russia, a P5 member. They have not only rights as a P5 member, they do also have obligation, which are labeled in the charter to secure international peace. And therefore, also other countries, also other actors have asked questions to China. And we have seen also slightly movements beginning with their call for not using nuclear weapons. And I think also lately you could have seen developments, because obviously what your question was, there's also a tendency to be seen that it could also fall back off to them what they are saying to others if they are not commenting now the current situation.
Let me ask you, one of the powerful points you made in your speech is that economics is geopolitical. And you said we have to see all economic interactions through a geopolitical lens. As you know, as you mentioned, in recent years, Australia was subjected to a campaign of economic coercion. I was struck that you mentioned you'd observed that, you saw Australia as a role model, you were impressed that we maintained a sense of proportion. Can you talk a little bit more about the conclusions that you drew from that episode about how to withstand that kind of economic coercion when it comes from a large neighbour?
Well, I think, first of all, it is this understanding that military means and diplomacy, this is not only the two means for security, but that security is way broader. In a way, this is totally simple. This is why I quoted Mr. Evans, who said that already 78 years ago. But in between, sometimes, obviously, societies and government tend to forget it, because we have seen also, and this is why for us it's so kind of new and important that we drafted our security strategy, because beforehand we had only a security strategy drafted by the Defense Ministry and the Foreign Ministry together, seeing security as military means plus diplomacy and maybe a bit international cooperation. And for the first time, we did what other countries did as well, maybe a bit before us, to say, okay, also the question, for example, climate crisis is a security threat to us. But defending democracy, defending our freedom, this is also of security concerns. And these attacks on democracies and our freedoms are not being done by rockets or drones, but being done by cyber attacks. If you see that if you have attacks on 3 hospitals in Germany, in a federal country, in 3 different federal states, from our constitution, we from the federal level cannot even do anything, because then each separate federal state would have to react to that. And having the understanding that we could be attacked without any military means is something new in our debate. And yes, we have seen it from examples like in Australia, that it doesn't have to be cyber attacks, which also you and others have experienced. But if there would be a ban on critical materials, which is highly needed to society, like in Australia, your coal export, but also other projects, that you could harm an economy so badly. And this is, again, I would say, like in quotation marks, the benefit of dictators and autocratic regimes. They don't have to fear, like democracies, that in 3 years' time, when the economy is down, we see it with Russia and the sanctions, that people wouldn't vote for them anymore. Because in a dictatorship and in an autocracy, obviously, you have banned elections beforehand. But in democratic countries, and this is what makes us so vulnerable, obviously, if your economy goes down, if your unemployment rates are going up, governments will feel that at the next election post. And this threat that democracies especially can be targeted also by economic means. If you put up sanctions, I would say you could see in Australia trying to blackmail Australia. We have seen that with Lithuania. The whole purpose that they could not export their products anymore was to try to separate Lithuania from the EU and try to give in. I'm not into your internal discussions, but what I've heard and read, obviously you didn't give in, but why did you have the chance? But maybe you can also explain it from your side. My reading was why you couldn't or had the chance to not give in was also that you had some tools in your hands, that obviously China also needed your call. This was a problem from Lithuania. It's a very small country. It's like with only a couple of millions of inhabitants. They didn't have something where they can counter this blackmailing, any projects like in Australia. So the only counter argument was European unity, that the whole EU said enough is enough. And if products are not being allowed on the market anymore, maybe they are not Lithuanian products. In the end, we labeled them as EU products because other EU products were needed. And our reading was from your situation, because you asked me for that. What could we learn? That obviously, if you're having such a dependency that you can be blackmailed 100%, you're in a kind of lose-lose situation. So to have also not only decouple with one part, with coal or with other projects, but have cooperation. And this is why we are saying we also need China as a partner, not only with regard to fighting climate change, but in a partner with other sectors, so that they could not say to Europe, we ban all the raw material and then the economy in Europe is being down. But they know if they would do that, and we have our anti-coercion measurements, we would say, well, you also have some projects, or you want your products on our market, it would also harm you. So seeing these tools, obviously peaceful tools, but however powerful tools in the economic dimension, is something we have seen with you, where you very balanced, didn't say we stop all the import-export with China, but obviously made China quite clear that it would be also very risky for them if they would totally decouple, or they use it as blackmailing with you.
I'd love to talk about Australia-China relations with you and the importance of strength and consistency and, as you say, sharing the risk. But I also want to bring in some other colleagues who've been asking questions. So let me start with a couple of questions from think tankers, and then I'll take one or two questions from the media. First of all, a colleague of mine at the Institute, Mihai Sora, a research fellow. Mihai congratulates you on opening your embassy in Fiji, as you mentioned in your prepared remarks. What do you hope to achieve for Germany with an increased presence on the ground in the Pacific?
Good question. And I've been asked this question a couple of times in Germany, because I think we have to be also very honest between foreign offices, between a think tank institute and ministries. It's quite obvious yet that you say you need cooperation in a globalized world. However, speaking again about citizens and democracy, I've had also many questions, especially when our plane broke down. So actually, why did she go there first place? What does she want to do? And then your region is so beautiful, doing in such a beautiful holiday reason. So I had to actually explain that partnership and cooperation and diplomacy, the currency of diplomacy is interaction, is visits. And you have said it quite friendly in the beginning, but you can say it also very harsh. The last foreign minister to Australia who visited was in 2011. And then Merkel was there. But obviously in between, nobody from us, from the foreign ministry of Chancellor visited you. And that partnership is also seeing each other regularly, is of high importance. And then with Fiji and the small island states, frankly speaking, this is our first embassy not on Fiji, but on all Pacific island states. So it's kind of a joint embassy. And we are opening this to enhance our cooperation, obviously. And if you do not have an embassy, you can have less cooperation on the climate issue because of the Small Island Forum, because we joined now as partners in the Blue Pacific. And also to have with the Pacific Island Forum or the Pacific Community better exchange on their biggest threat, the climate crisis. again, because, I mean, talking and giving speeches is great. But if people on the islands are saying, if you want to help us, you obviously have to know what's going on here. And as you might know, we do have already a couple of partnerships with the small island states in Papua Guinea, in the Solomon Island to protect the coral reef, but also to support Vanuta's initiative at the International Court of Justice. But it's also security issue, obviously. So our embassy there is not only because of strengthening our ties with the climate crisis, but also, as we have seen, other countries, because they might be closer, but also because they have a strategic interest, are quite more regular there on the visits. We have seen that all these small island states voted in the General Assembly banning the war of aggression from Putin. But they could have also said, I mean, we are small islands, so where is actually Ukraine and what the hell do we have to do with it? They didn't do so, what we really appreciate. But only applause doesn't help. So this is why also for us, this has the geopolitical dimension. If these small island states are standing up for us in Europe, for our security, we want to make clear also with our embassy that their security concerns also concerns us. And this is why we are also present now with an embassy on the ground.
All right, thank you. I have a question from Torsten Benner, Director of the Global Public Policy Institute. And he says Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong talks about both deterrence and guardrails as key elements to prevent escalation and war over Taiwan. So he asks, what is Germany's approach to the deterrence of threats to the peaceful status quo in the Taiwan Strait, as well as guardrails between the key players?
Well, first of all, as he's still online, Torsten Benner, best greetings, because this was also, we tried to bring also one of our best researchers on the matters to the region. He was in the same plane. So it's good that we are together here again. Well, obviously, and this is the academic debate, the political academic debate we're having also in Germany. Again, I would like to underline also the Taiwan Strait. It's quite far away. So again, in Germany, you have to explain, first of all, well, where it is, many people know, but why it's of such an importance also for us, also for the global interest. And I quoted how much container ships go through this strait. And I was also quoting this again in China at the press conference, making clear, because we are talking about international law, we are calling on China and others to support our international rules. So first of all, we are saying, obviously, all the regional actors have the primacy in dealing with their regional concerns. But if it's addressing so much also the international order, international rules, it's obviously also in the global interest that there is no closure of the Taiwan Strait. So the question is, what is the best to do? And this is a debate we are also having with Torsten Benner and others. How much pressure and how much diplomatic action there? I believe that it's already a change in course, that German Foreign Minister, that European Commission President von der Leyen are speaking about the Taiwan Strait, making clear that this is also of our concern, making clear that we do have international rules about these kind of trade routes. This is why I quoted also UNCLOS and other treaties we are having. And as I've said, that we would not accept any coercive or military change in the status quo. And again, you ask about how I perceived that China with the Russian war. In this horrible war, sometimes there are side effects which might help in other discussions. My impression was when I was in China speaking also to many German companies with German Chinese employees, that the situation that there was such a unity of reaction, not only from EU, not only from G7 NATO, but from 140 states towards Russia's brutal breach of the UN Charter, has been heard and seen obviously also in China. If fundamental international law is being broken, that the EU, that the international community is, even though sometimes we are a bit slowly as democracies, but we are capable of being there united. And this has already at least changed a bit the discourse about the whole situation. However, and this is why I also quoted what we are doing, supporting and training together in the security and military form. Obviously, I do not want to say only thank you that you are supporting also Ukraine in their right of self-defense military, but that our security concern is also your security concern and vice versa. And this is why we are participating in the different trainings, which we haven't done in the past.
All right. Thank you, Minister. I'm sorry to hear that Torsten Benner was also stranded in the Gulf by your aircraft malfunction. I want to reassure you that here at the Lowy Institute, we still believe in German engineering, Minister. Let me get in one or two more questions if I can. I have a question from Kirsty Needham from Reuters. Kirsty asks, does Germany support the opening of a NATO office in the Indo-Pacific?
Frankly speaking, I believe that this is a very sensitive question, because what we shouldn't underestimate, and this is one of my biggest learnings in the last 1.5 years, we talked about that also cyber attacks, also economic ties can be a weapon of war in a globalized world. But this counts also for disinformation, fake news, which we have been seeing not only with the Russian war, and especially in the beginning, we were really afraid that there was such a setup from Russia with total fake news, where people around the world couldn't maybe see whether it was really a Russian attack or Ukraine did also something on a Russian territory, because with artificial intelligence, I mean, you can do whatever you want. But we do not only see this fake news and this power of narrative, positive and negative narratives, obviously in the Russian war, but also in Africa. If we look at Niger, for example, now at the moment, the whole discussion where ECOWAS is calling for support from others. Yesterday, my colleague from Senegal was here in Berlin, and she was telling me how important it is that ECOWAS has the primary role. If we can, Europeans would support them, because the narrative from the junta that actually the former government, the democratic elected government, was just on behalf of international actors, or if something would be done now by ECOWAS, if it would be too close to a cooperation with European, the fake news about this has been something from outside would be so powerful. And this is why I'm saying this argument, not to bypass the answer to this question, why I'm really thinking a lot these kind of questions. We want to strengthen our ties also in the military cooperation, also in the security cooperation. However, especially with NATO, we can see that this argument, NATO started this war, that war, right or wrong, yeah, no matter what. But Afghanistan, we have a question about Kosovo. So this is a very, unfortunately, strong and in most part fake argument. So I think we have to be really careful that there's not now the narrative. NATO is doing something now in the Pacific, whereas NATO is a defense alliance, a transatlantic defense alliance, and therefore these are very sensitive topics and discussions. And I think what matters is a cooperation and not so much symbolic action.
All right, Minister, I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and ask you the final question, if I can. Often in the West, you find that political figures on the right are very strong on hard security issues but weak on climate change. And often those on the left are very strong on climate change policy but weak on hard security. You make a powerful argument for being strong on both hard security and on climate change. And you make the argument, I think, that solidarity is important both in maintaining a rules-based order and avoiding dangerous global warming. Because it's such a powerful argument, can you just talk a bit about the commonalities between hard security and climate change?
Well, also thank you for that question, and also to make it a bit more lively. When I came into office, we agreed in the government that foreign climate policy will go to the Foreign Office. And there was a bit of debate. So why is she doing that now? Because she's the green foreign minister. And now she also wants to have the neat topic of climate, like a good feeling topic for a green, as you have said, because maybe rather on the left, you talk about climate. And my argument was, it's not about green. it's about the reality that the climate threat is the biggest security threat for many countries in the world. That we have seen that, unfortunately, the climate crisis doesn't only cause environmental damage or damage to people, but that it's an accelerator, especially for conflict regions. And we have seen that over the last years. We have heard it from small countries, or we have heard it from those countries confronted with this. And I would say it was one of my best decisions to do this, because in half of my talks now, if the foreign ministry, if me in person weren't be totally into this topic, half of my discussion partners would say, well, she doesn't understand our security threat. So unfortunately, the climate crisis, or put it positively, fighting the climate crisis is one of the most important security answers, because it's an accelerator for conflicts. We have seen that in so many smaller discussions around the Chad lake, for example. The lake got smaller and smaller, terrorists raised and raised, not only due to the climate crisis, but also because of the climate crisis, because fishermen could not work anymore. Terrorist groups were going through the villages, recruiting young boys, which could before working on the lake with farmlands, which was not able now anymore, not speaking about drinking water and all the other issues. So bringing this together is in our deepest security interest. And this is why in our national security strategy, the third chapter is about the question of fighting the climate crisis, strengthening biodiversity and environmental protection. To see it, protecting our livelihood is in our pure security interest. The good news, maybe to end on a good news, I would say, is that also speaking as a Green, having these debates in the last 10 years, now it has come to everybody's agenda. Maybe for a green reason, maybe for a human reason, but maybe also for purely economic interest. This is the good news about it, I would say, that even though if countries, governments, people do not believe because of saving the planet that they have to fight climate crisis, the understanding that this is a security concern and that this is the revolution in the whole economy, so also business-wise, it's a smarter thing to do, is I think the good news, because we can see also in many countries, and I mean, your country is still in coal, to be frank and open. My country has formulated a coal phase-out, but we are also doing still lignite mining. So it's not about accusing other countries, but we can also see in the big oil-producing state that obviously they do not want to end their business now to lose a lot of money, but they are dual-track because they are preparing everything to be also the first movers with the biggest solar panels. So I think this is a good news in the end. For whatever reason, fighting the climate crisis has been or is now on the agenda's top level. And if we join hands now to fight it, hopefully we can at least make, in this regard, some parts of the world a safer place.
Minister, we're out of time. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for paying us the compliment of giving a serious speech. Thank you for answering the questions with the frankness that you're known for. And thank you also for ending on a positive note. I very much hope that next time, if your Air Force allows, you'll speak to the Lowy Institute in person. Dankeschön, Frau Ministerin.
Dankeschön as well. Yeah, and I hope so too. And again, thank you so much. I know how tricky this is to set out these kind of formats digitally wise, and then with the time difference. So thank you so much to you, Michael, in person, but to the whole Institute. Thank you very much, and hope to see you in person then in a couple of months. Bye-bye.
Thank you again. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today at the Lowy Institute. We look forward to welcoming you to another event soon, whether online or here at 31 Bligh Street. Good day.